Hello, I'm Dan Boscov-Ellen from Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, and my talk is entitled Climate Migration and the Dangers of Green Liberalism. So first, I just want to start by thanking everyone at the World-Ecology Network for putting this conference together and for fostering such a lovely community of scholars. I know it's a lot of work, even under normal circumstances, to put something like this together, and I'm sure this has been full of crazy logistical challenges. So I just want to say how much I appreciate all of the work that's gone into this and how excited I am to be here. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking a little bit about why I think we should consider the Biden administration's climate strategy, one that heavily stresses national security and economic benefits for American workers in making the case for partial climate action, while retaining certain core commitments to the fossil economy and remaining deeply hostile to immigration, as an important moment in the evolving relationship between liberal politics, the climate crisis, and the xenophobic racist agenda of the far right. Although there are obviously significant differences between the rhetoric of right-wing ethno-nationalists and what I'll characterize as Biden's more pluralist climate nationalism, I believe it is important to note their affinities and synergies in order to understand the ways in which mainstream liberal approaches to climate change may ultimately help to validate and strengthen the far right. I will argue that attention to this potential ideological pipeline and to the structural limits that preclude adequate responses within a liberal political framework helps to sharpen our picture of an appropriate eco-socialist politics, in contrast with various reform-oriented social democratic visions of climate action that have gained some popularity on the left of late. Since I only have 20 minutes, I won't be able to touch on every part of this broader argument today. In this talk, my focus is primarily on the question of climate-induced displacement and migration, and the discussion will mostly be confined to the Americas, although I believe the themes are more broadly applicable in many cases. I am, of course, not the first to highlight this danger in the context of immigration politics. In 2015, for example, John Hultgren noted in his book, Border Walls Gone Green, that, quote, progressive, leftist, and even radical ecological efforts to green sovereignty, to render the nation's state more sustainable, are in many cases actually serving to shore up exclusionary forms of political community, end quote. But this problem, which I alluded to last time in Binghamton with respect to some leftish versions of the Green New Deal, has become even more starkly highlighted in the Biden administration's center-right co-option of progressive climate politics. In explaining why I find this form of climate governance so troubling, I'm going to begin by briefly recounting some of the current administration's positions and rhetoric vis-a-vis climate change and migration. I'll then argue that this framework for climate action is the most natural for liberals in imperialist countries to adopt in the present conjuncture. And finally, I'll explain why this framework, which is abhorrent enough on its own, tends in various ways towards its supersession by something worse. All right, so first, let me just briefly talk a little bit about some of the features of the Biden administration's climate policies and rhetoric. As one might expect, and similar to the Obama administration, they have first stressed the role of the private sector in solving this problem. So Kerry, who is Biden's climate emissary, says no government is going to solve climate change, right? The change is going to come from the private sector, and the government needs to create the framework within which the private sector can do what it does best. Of course, this might be a somewhat partial view. If we look at what the private sector is actually doing right now, you can see that it's not just fossil capital, but also companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Disney, that often sort of present a climate-friendly face, are also spending big to try and defeat climate legislation in the United States. Meanwhile, the Walton family has spent over $200 million pushing water privatization as the solution to climate water scarcity. So it's sort of maybe like a mixed bag in terms of what the private sector is actually up to. But when they say that no government is going to solve climate change, they certainly do mean it with respect to themselves. So some of the initial regulations and subsidies that were proposed notwithstanding, the Biden administration has still shown an unwillingness to directly challenge the power of fossil capital. This can be probably most clearly seen in the way that they have reacted, or rather not reacted, to the fight over Line 3. But this has been sort of like a common theme, right? The administration actually argued against using the most recent IPCC report in order to halt offshore drilling. So they're moving ahead with selling a bunch of stuff for offshore drilling, even as massive oil spills take place on both coasts of the United States. And the emphasis on the private sector is sort of like one of the central frames of this approach, right? When Biden says today is Climate Day in the White House, which means today is Jobs Day in the White House, we're talking about American innovation, American products, American labor, right? So there's a strong emphasis on increasing national economic competitiveness and on the economic benefits, particularly for the American middle class, and trying to sell this climate agenda. And this has gone alongside a particularly strong emphasis on climate change in the context of national security. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. But this is something that has been fairly distinctive in the Biden administration, as this is sort of like, I would argue in many respects, the master frame through which they've started to discuss the climate problem. Good. So let me also just briefly touch on the Biden administration's policies and rhetoric so far with respect to migration. So there's been less pretense of progressivism here. The default has really been to keep Trump's policies more or less intact, unless it becomes politically untenable to do so. So for example, you could look at what happened with refugee caps, which Biden was initially going to keep the same, and then they had to raise a little bit after there was an uproar. Same with his comments over the possibility of continuing construction of the border wall. And they've been actually fighting in court in order to preserve some of Trump's most insidious immigration policies, in particular, the use of Title 42 to sort of like do an end run around the legal requirement to allow people to claim asylum at the border. So this is under the pretext of public health and security, because we're in a pandemic. They've used this as an excuse to just kick people out without due process. And the Biden administration has really been pushing to keep that rule in place. This has gone alongside the sort of like usual cruelty and creation of danger at the border, as well as a projection of strength in order to try and deter migration. So this is a longstanding US policy. It was actually really ramped up under Clinton in the 90s. And of course, then again, under Trump. But you can see this also at work very clearly in the Biden administration. So on the left here, you have a few things that were put out in Spanish saying, don't come over, we're saying it clearly. These were tweeted out from the official embassy accounts in various Latin American countries by the United States. Rhetoric then echoed by Biden's vice president, Kamala Harris. And again, the administration has sort of like tried to balance some pretense of concern for human rights with the need to deter migration, right? Which has really taken a much stronger emphasis here. So I imagine that the awfulness of the Biden administration doesn't come as a terrible surprise to the Marxists in the audience or to anyone else paying attention to reality, really. But I want to be clear that this isn't just a case of centrist Democrats being weak or disappointing or whatever. The Biden administration's position is the logical one in many ways for liberal politicians in imperialist countries to take. And although some of the particulars are contingent, so for example, the pandering to the right on immigration, which they've been doing pretty badly, seems kind of like unlikely to work. The basic contours of the position reflect the structural constraints of liberal climate politics. So I'll just try and briefly spell this out. Conjuncturally, we must recognize that much of cross-border migration to the global north today is the product of what Christian Parenti calls the catastrophic convergence. That is the supercharged synthesis of imperialist destabilization and climate change, with climate change playing an ever greater part in the mix. So think, for example, of people coming from the so-called dry corridor in Central America, particularly parts of Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, who've had their existing lives made untenable by a long and ongoing legacy of imperial violence, combined with the increasing precarity of subsistence farming in the region. And this sort of migration, induced by capitalist socio-ecological disaster, both internal and cross-border, is almost certain to continue growing sharply over the coming century. This is one of the reasons that liberals are increasingly talking about climate change as a national security threat. While a handful of left liberals and social democrats recognize a limited responsibility towards such migrants, so for example, AOC criticized Harris's rhetoric on Guatemala, saying, quote, "We can't help set someone's house on fire and then blame them for fleeing," end quote. A wide-scale recognition and reparative reconfiguration of the border regime, never mind border abolition and the cessation of imperialist violence and the exploitation that drives climate vulnerability and migration, are incompatible with basic features of liberalism in both its neoliberal and its more social democratic forms. The horizons of this political form in the capitalist core are perhaps some refugee resettlement and some increased adaptation aid, but it must always maintain border violence and leverage imperial power in order to protect the privileges of empire. And I think Max Eil's recent book on a People's Green New Deal brings this out really nicely if folks are looking for a longer version of that argument. Now, some liberals and social democrats are more open about this. So for example, when Bernie Sanders was asked whether he supports open borders, he says, "If you open the borders, my God, there's a lot of poverty in this world, and you're going to have people from all over the world. And I don't think that's something that we can do at this point, can't do it," right? While others may couch the need for border restriction in terms of national security, social cohesion, and self-determination, et cetera. So that's the route that liberal philosophers usually take. Now, in evaluating this sort of position, we often tend to frame it in terms of lesser evilism. So one might say, sure, Biden's climate policies are insufficient and remain steadfastly imperialist, but all things considered, they're clearly better than right-wing climate denial, overt racism, and the active arson of the Trump administration. That framing may indeed be reasonable in some respects, but I think it may be misleading in others, beyond the usual objections to lesser evilism, of course. It's potentially deceptive in part, I think, because it assumes a steady political landscape where environmental concern is the purview of the left and anathema to the far right. I think that assumption is quite questionable. We might instead think of a position like the Biden administration's as a template for the far right of the future. The prospect of shifting right-wing engagement with the climate crisis has started to seep into left discourse. So Naomi Klein, for example, devotes part of her recent book on fire to the specter of rising eco-fascism. But probably the most influential recent addition to this discussion is a book called White Skin, Black Fuel on the Dangers of Fossil Fascism. Sorry, that's a tongue twister, by Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective. The book bills itself as, quote, "the first systematic inquiry into the political ecology of the far right and the climate crisis," end quote. And I think that's probably an accurate description. I think it's a largely compelling and definitely thoroughly researched picture of contemporary right-wing politics in the global north. And although it doesn't spend a ton of time analyzing them, it correctly identifies some of the continuities between mainstream liberal climate politics and the growing far right. As Malm and company put it, quote, "She who does not wish to speak of fossil capital and the liberal ideology that has sustained it should also be silent about fossil fascism and its prefigurations," end quote. However, Malm's analysis remains surprisingly confident about the near impossibility of a sustained green nationalist movement, which he says would entail, quote, "a break with denial and a rebranding of various nationalist policies as a remedy," end quote. While acknowledging that it already possessed a relatively coherent shape in the 2010s, uniting parties such as National Rally and combatants like Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter who wrote an eco-fascist manifesto before he murdered 50 people. Mom thinks that a broader and more stable green nationalism is unlikely to emerge because parties that have flirted with it in Europe nonetheless have continued to oppose mitigation measures and often slip back into denialism. Mom suggests that that a more solid and authentic form of green nationalism, which for him basically means white nationalism with green characteristics here, is unlikely in part because it is not grounded in reality. It has to hold that climate change is caused by population growth in the global south or by immigration to the global north, and neither of those claims is plausible. The right might sometimes adopt the language of ecology for strategic purposes, but it cannot do so consistently because, quote, the sole conceivable foundation for valuing mitigation as such seems to be solidarity, end quote. That's a perspective that's utterly alien to the right. Since border controls and racism won't actually do anything to halt climate change, for Mom, it seems likely that the eco and eco-fascism is almost predetermined to always be a sham. Thus, rather than engaging with the climate problem more seriously, Mom finds it likely that the far right will coalesce around fossil capital, using the perceived dangers of mitigation to fuel reaction. And we are familiar with this strategy, right? This is Marjorie Taylor Greene taking aim at a Prius that's labeled socialism. She blows it up in this video, right? So anything that sort of like smells at all of climate consciousness is just communism, right? So we're used to sort of like that story. And so Mom thinks that the right might well use the effects of climate change, particularly in the form of increased migration, to advance its agenda, as indeed is already happening. But he's confident that denialism will continue to win the day. He chastises Naomi Klein for arguing that the right will soon have to begin acknowledging climate reality and thus create an opening for ecofascism, arguing that, quote, to posit a causal relationship between catastrophic degree of global heating and far-right recognition of it is to bet on rationality, which he thinks is a losing bet. Mom here assumes that the interests of fossil capital and the far right will remain perfectly in step. But although he largely dismisses the possibility, it seems plausible to me that more perspicacious right-wing figures and sectors of the capitalist class will recognize the popularity of some forms of climate action among their existing and potential base, particularly adaptation, I think, and particularly in more rural areas, as well as the increasing climate anxiety in the global north among young people, and some of the real dangers to their bottom line that climate change poses, and combine this with some faux ecological pretexts for curbing immigration and working to keep the global south poor. And you can think here back to Title 42 and sort of like use your imagination about how that might go. The popular patriotism of national infrastructure and protection of the heartland, mixed with virulent forms of ethno-nationalism, would be a potent mixture, playing on both the fears and the supremacist beliefs of many whites in the global north, and allowing many members of the ruling elite to preserve the system from which they continue to benefit. It would, of course, not be sufficient to deal meaningfully and fairly with climate change, but then neither is Biden's liberalism. The right, should it take this path, or something like it, will be set up to play Biden's game better than Biden can. One reason they will have an easier time with such a position is that liberalism purports to value justice and equality while maintaining and manufacturing inequality and injustice. Climate change supercharges this dynamic and brings the international injustices increasingly back to our doorstep. This gap between liberal rhetoric and reality, when it becomes stark enough, has historically created monsters. So if folks have read Barbara Field's on race, for example, she says something to the effect of, those who held all men to be equal and held Afro-Americans as slaves had no choice but to end up codifying the idea or, reifying the idea of race as an explanation. The right, meanwhile, will generally be more than happy to step in and act without the usual liberal compunctions. While they may be more comfortable existing in a fact-free world, fascists don't actually have to deny a lot of the reality. They can just justify it based on their racial superiority and anti-communism. So for example, the right doesn't have to ignore or soften US history in Latin America They openly celebrate Pinochet and dream of giving the rest of us helicopter rides. Thus, the primary fault lines of the future, if denialism does begin to weaken, are likely to be between those who care about justice and the root causes of climate disaster, as do many of young people today, and those who don't. And if I'm correct, then this reality has entailments for what forms of eco-socialism we ought to pursue and which we ought to avoid. Although unfortunately, I can't develop the argument further here, I think the most obvious implication is that we should treat with extreme caution the idea of eco-socialism in one country, particularly if it's a country in the global north, and the temptation to pander or court power with nationalist climate policies. While some strategic compromises and coalition building are often inevitable, the only reasonable position for us to take is a resolute internationalism and anti-imperialism. In other words, we need a world ecological politics. We also have to take care that that a narrow and binary understanding of anti-imperialism does not enable or excuse other forms of authoritarianism and pseudo-environmentalism. There's been, for example, a lot of apologism for China today on the eco-socialist left, and this is, I think, a parallel tendency that we will need to avoid. Of course, such a world ecological politics still requires further articulation and elaboration and a basis in mass organizations if it's to have any chance of success. But I think a good first step is being clear about the dangers of trying to work exclusively or primarily within existing liberal political structures. Thank you.